Jeff Ballabon from the ACLJ, thanks for joining us. Tell us what this whole controversy about judicial reform is all about.
Thanks, Chris. Look, there's the reality of judicial reform and there's the politics of judicial reform. So let's talk about the reality first, and maybe we'll also talk about the politics, because obviously this has become huge news. My father called me last night from America worried about me because of protests. I said I was simply unaware where I am here in Jerusalem that there were protests, but it's being played in the media around the world and in America.
Yeah.
The reality is that judicial reform has been an issue that right and left have broadly agreed on for probably 30 years. Not exactly what reforms are needed, but the mainstream in Israel across the board understands there need to be reforms. And there's a simple reason. Starting in the late 80s, Justice Aaron Barak, then the president of the Supreme Court, and by the way, a professor of mine in law school, started aggregating power to the court, power unheard of in any free country in the world, something that Americans couldn't actually imagine. For example, there's a combination, there's no constitution, there's no written constitution, no balance of powers. So there's a combination of powers the court has taken for itself and no one can stop them. For example, there's no concept of standing or justiciability. And they have a concept of reasonableness. Now, what do those mean when you put them together? In America, in order to have a case come before a court, in order for them to have the power, the right to decide something, the case has to be justiciable. It means it has to be, someone has to be suffer for it, has to have standing to bring it to the court, and the court has to have the right to make the decision. Not everything is justiciable. They've wiped that out here. Literally anything is justiciable. At whose decision, at whose discretion? The courts itself. And they apply a doctrine called reasonableness. Now, reasonableness exists in other countries, but not like it does here. Here, what it means is a judge decides something's unreasonable and simply nullifies it. I'll give you an example because it's really hard for Americans to even conceive of what kind of power this is. The court here can nullify an election. The public votes on an individual, and the court says, well, I think it was unreasonable, in my opinion. There's no standard. The judge says, in my opinion, I think it was unreasonable for this person to be a candidate. And so call this whole election off. It doesn't matter what the people think. That's the least democratic thing imaginable, right? They have intervened in the Knesset's ability to even discuss legislation. No, you can't discuss this legislation. In the instant situation, they did something extraordinary. They issued, well, they didn't issue it. They upheld a statement or a ruling by what's the equivalent of the Attorney General here, but again, superpowers, that the head of the country, the head of the coalition, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, could not express his views on the issue of judicial reform, could not engage in political speech. The most protected speech of all. So these powers are unheard of in America. And they want to simply restore a balance of powers or create a balance of powers. Now, is every reform going to be accepted by everybody? No. Should these reforms be debated? Yes. But instead, we get to the politics.